how it is unique is to a degree dependent on the audience that I am targeting, and this series of Indian lives is targeting. And that's the educated, curious Indian who wants to learn about the major figures of the past, and through those biographies, acting as a lens, understand the historical context in which these major figures of ancient India and modern India lived and worked. That's one way. Second is, most, if not all, biographies or even studies of Ashoka have depended to a larger or lesser extent on the Buddhist narrative around the King Ashoka, who is viewed within Buddhist historiography as the major Buddhist king, almost like a Buddhist Constantine who brought Buddhism to the world, to Asia especially. And it is through these narratives that postdate Ashoka by probably 3 centuries, that the world has come to know Ashoka, and the modern studies of Ashoka somehow or other is filtered through that medium. I try to break that by going only, or principally at least, to the words of Ashoka himself, as recorded in his inscriptions. Where I depart from that is to give the broader context of the times in which Ashoka lived, which we can gather through archaeological and through art historical, as well as through the writings of the contemporary Greek kingdoms in West Asia, with whom Ashoka was in contact, diplomatic contact. So in that sense, mine is based on Ashoka's own words and trying to interpret those words to come to an understanding of the person behind those words, to understand who Ashoka is. So I subtitled the text, the book, as the portrait of a philosopher king. It's a portrait in the sense that it's something that emerges from the words of Ashoka. So in that sense, it is different from many of the others. I'm not saying that I'm path-breaking in any particular way. I'm not claiming something unique in that sense. But I hope also that it is a readable text. Ramachandra Guha talked about the elegance of the prose. And I tried to make the prose elegant so that it will be a easy, inviting vehicle for the educated English reader to understand who Ashoka was. There are no language impediments to entering this book. Often scholars, and I've been a scholar for 50 years, write in jargon, which doesn't seem jargon to us because we are so used to it, right? It's like a doctor talking about medicine and prescriptions and they think that it is normal and nobody else understands a word of what they're saying. So I try to go beyond that and try to use normal words. So that's one thing in which I feel the book is, well, to use a modern term, user-friendly, right? People can read this without having to have specialized knowledge of anything. Where specialized knowledge would be required, where I try to show some caution about certain things, I put it in the footnotes. I think to say that Ashoka turned to Buddhism as a redemptive act after the atrocities of Kalinga is too simplistic and in all likelihood inaccurate. He does not say that. What I think is a more accurate way of looking at it is that he was dabbling in Buddhism for quite a while. And it was natural for people of that time in that location, which is what is today Bihar, to experiment with various kinds of new religions that were emerging at the time. There was Jainism, there were the Ajivakas, and there was Buddhism, which was probably the most successful of the several ascetic religions that were emerging at the time. What he says actually is that he was a Buddhist, so-and-so Buddhist, but and then he became a Upasaka, as he says, but he was sort of a so-so Buddhist. He wasn't very devout. And it was 2 years after those initial forays into Buddhism, where he said he went to see the Sangha. Sangha is the Buddhist monastic order, maybe a single monk, maybe several monks. After which encounter with the monks, he said he began to strive. The word is very important, the strive. And this he says in the very first minor rock inscription. It was after that that he became a fully fledged Upasaka and became a Buddhist. The connection to the Kalinga episode is, I think, instructive, because if you look at the timeline, I try to give the timeline in the book, it is somewhat after, maybe months after the Kalinga War. So there is some way in which we can connect not his initial turn to Buddhism, but his full embrace of Buddhism as an Upasaka, as he says, a devout Buddhist, to the experience he had in Kalinga and his regret at what he had done within Kalinga. So I think there is some connection to that, but not, I do not think, and Professor Romila Thapar had said this 50 years ago, we cannot see a causal connection between the atrocities of Kalinga, the war in Kalinga, and his turning to Buddhism. It is difficult to say why, because here we are dealing with silencers. And I try to say in the book that sometimes silencers are as important or even more important than what is said, because often silencers are not deliberate. So which means that these are points that could be very significant with regard to what Ashoka is trying to say. Why doesn't he say that anything about the Varna system? It could have 3 or 4 different explanations. One is the Varna system did not exist in India the way it has been portrayed to be. Second is that he didn't know about it. It was there, but he didn't know about it. Or thirdly, it could be that he knew about it, but he didn't think it was significant enough to mention. It didn't rise to that level. So it was a thing that was there, but wasn't very socially or religiously significant, at least in his eyes. This is, I think, important because in dealing with ancient Indian history, we have looked at a set of texts from which we get most of the information. And those texts were written by a small group of elite male Brahmins, right? I have nothing against them, but they represent a very, very small group of people. So if we look about India, if you look at India through the lens provided by them, we are looking through a peephole into this vast time and geography. So we need to find other voices, other statements. And one of the principal ones that we find from the 3rd century before Christ are the inscriptions of Ashoka. The fact that they are silent on this point, not only on the Varna system, the term Varna itself, but also the 3 of the 4 components of Varna, the Kshatriya, the Vaishya, and the Shudra. They are not mentioned in the inscriptions either. The only one to be mentioned is the Brahmana. But the Brahmana is mentioned not as a demographic group, but as a religious group. And they are contrasted to what Ashoka calls Shramana or Samana, who are the ascetics who live life apart from society, the Buddhist monks the Jain monks, the Ajivika ascetics. They are the people who are called samanas. So he thinks of the whole of the religious landscape of his time as composing of two kinds of people: the Brahmins, who were one kind of religious people, and the other, the Samanas, another kind of religious people. Brahmins, he doesn't say who Brahmins are, what they believed in, what they did, but it is likely that they were the hereditary priesthood of the time, and I think it is instructive to see at least part of what is happening in India at the time through the landscape provided by Ashoka. Centered in the early Brahmanical texts is a portrayal of society on the ground. So is it a sociology, in other words, right? A demography, or is it an ideology, a prescriptive take on what the society should be rather than what the society is? I have argued for some time that it is the latter, that they are much more prescriptive than they are descriptive. And in that sense, if we take what is given in those texts as somehow or other representative of ancient Indian society on the ground, then we are probably making a mistake, right? We are taking theological arguments, philosophical arguments, moral arguments as sociologically descriptive of society. And it is very difficult because much of the writings of this period comes from the Brahmanical sources. We have Buddhist and Jain sources, but often they are from a much later period. And they are often, as we find them, rather tinged with polemics against Brahmins. So in a sense, co-opting the Brahmanical arguments in a different way. I try to keep away from modern Indian discourse for the simple reason I don't know enough. I am not an Indian. I come from Sri Lanka. I have lived in America for the last 30, 40 years. So it is not for me to tell how the Indians should live or incorporate the values that is found in Ashoka. But I think the fourth part of my book deals with what I called the ecumenical spirit of Ashoka. And I use the word in the sense, ecumenism means breaking barriers, going beyond yourself and your own group to find value in others, in other groups. And that is significant for Ashoka. He tells that Pasanda is the term he used in a value-free way to describe the various religious groups within society. And he names four of them: Brahmins, Buddhists, Jains, and Ajivikas. And he says, and others. So there were other groups also. He talks about Pashandas in the Greek kingdoms of the West. So there were also similarly demographically identifiable groups who were espousing certain kinds of philosophies, moral theologies, etc. So he's trying to tell them to meet each other, to talk to each other, and you can become learned and wise only by listening to others, incorporating the words, the ideas of others. So in a sense, living in isolation, living in your own group is a recipe for being narrow and therefore unlearned and unwise. This, I think, can be expanded to the current way in which we live our lives. We all live in some kind of constrained demography. We belong to a particular class of society. We belong to a group of students or faculty or an intellectual class, people who work in a similar place in a workshop. They are the people with whom you talk. Ashoka is inviting us to go beyond your group, to talk to others who may not agree with you, who may have very different ideas from you. And I think this is something that both the political, the economic, and the social, and the philosophical systems, religious systems of the modern world can take from Ashoka's instructions to what he calls the passanders, to go beyond themselves. It is when you remain within yourself that you do have the kind of conflicts that often plagues societies. Right? And I think that may be a message that can resonate in the world today. And that's, I hope, people will take from the book here. That's a good question, to which I don't have a clear answer. But I think, as for all books in this series, I think the books in the series, and this is my book in particular because that's the only one that's so far published, gives an insight into a major figure of ancient India in a way that ordinary people can have access. As I said earlier, it is written in a non-jargonized language, and people can read it and absorb it without specialized knowledge. And I think that is an important part, especially for people who not only want to know about Ashoka, who is a popular figure in modern India, but also about their own past of the 3rd, 4th century, even 2nd century, before the Common Era, when Ashoka lived and operated, when Ashoka's father and grandfather lived and ruled the country. And I think that's the main reason for people to read the book, because it gives an entry point to a particular time in Indian history, as well as a fascinating life story of possibly the most fascinating figure in ancient India, apart from the religious figures such as the Buddha. So I think that is a major reason for people to read it, and people hopefully will go away with a great appreciation of the man who Ashoka was. If you look at the names of boys in modern India, and I make this point, the word Ashok as a name of a boy is so common and so popular. And if you go back to the 19th century, not a single Indian boy was ever called Ashok. So we had this within this 20th century where Ashoka became not only a national figure, but also a common name for a boy in India today.